Those last two lines from the John O'Donohue poem. Soon you will home in a new rhythm, for your soul senses the world that awaits you. These words transport me back in time. Back to my paternal grandparents' very small house on Cherry Street. That is where I first learned how to slow down and tune into the senses of my soul. My grandparents' Colorado was very different than the one that I grew up in. I grew up in a quiet, eerily clean suburb of southeast Denver. And my grandparents both were from Mexican immigrant backgrounds. And they lived in an industrial corner of North Denver, a place called Commerce City, where there was a mix of odors from oil refineries, pet food factories, and exhaust fumes plaguing and polluting the air. On the drive there, I would hold my breath and plug my nose. But once inside their modest home, I could finally exhale. And on the inhale, my nose would be greeted with these beautiful warm scents, perfectly charred tortillas, and the sweet, sweet smell of cinnamon from freshly brewed canela tea. Siéntate, come, sit, eat, my grandmother would say. And we'd be at the table and share a meal together, listening to Telemundo play faintly in the background. Any talk of school or work demands were very quickly sidelined, because going to my grandparents' house was all about one thing: rest. And in time, we would shuffle over from the kitchen table over to the living room, and I would get to lie down on this plastic-covered green couch, and I would curl up on my grandmother's lap. She had these immaculately kept bright red fingernails, and with them, she would rub my head and scratch my back, and she would sing this nursery rhyme. Sana, sana, colita de rana. Si no sana soy, sanará mañana. Until eventually, I would fall asleep. I didn't know any Spanish, so I had no idea what those words were that she was singing, but it didn't actually matter. Because going to my grandparents' house was not about making meaning of things, it was about tapping into sense wisdom. What mattered was not what the words said, but how they made me feel. Calm. Peace. Safe. And restored. And with this deep, deep sense of being enough, just as I was right there in my grandmother's arms. But away from that little house on Cherry Street, that very sacred downtime got gobbled up and almost completely forgotten by me. Because in time, I was socialized to compulsively consume more and more. And by my early adulthood, my identity became pegged with my work and my productivity. My worth was about being a human doing, and I almost forgot that I am a human being. I was depleted and running on fumes, my neck and back muscles sore and tight with knots from so much stress. I was in desperate need of a compassionate intervention, and one that didn't shame me, saying that it was my personal failure for not practicing self-care. And I definitely didn't want anything that offered me a form of shallow relief. That's when I found the brilliant work of artist and theologian, Tricia Hersey. And she helped me understand that rest is not only an opportunity for respite and renewal, it is also necessary for reconfiguring myself towards liberation. So here's the book. Da-da-da. In her book, Rest is Resistance, a manifesto, Tricia Hersey shares that rest saved her life. And she weaves personal storytelling, Black liberation, womanism, and somatics into this entire beautiful Rest is Resistance framework. Tricia's own rest resurrection started as a desperate attempt to get relief from exhaustion, which sounded very familiar to me. And as a child, she would sit and be at her grandmother's house. Her grandmother's name was Ora. And she would sit on a plastic-covered yellow couch to rest her eyes for 30 minutes a day. And Tricia would watch her grandmother with her eyes closed, wondering if she was asleep. She wasn't. She was just resting. It was one of her first examples of how powerful rest can be. But it goes deeper. Because Hersey prophetically names the ways that rest is an actual form of resistance. Because, beloveds, we are living in a time of pervasive grind culture, of sleep deprivation, mass exhaustion, and major burnout. This life-limiting and even deadly unsustainable pace of working is a byproduct of so many oppressive systems that are working together to keep our bodies and our spirits hostage, all for making profit. Hersey traces grind culture all the way back to an ideology that was present on slave plantations, where her ancestors' bodies were commodified and brutalized as tools for accumulating wealth. And today, the systems of capitalism, ableism, patriarchy, and white supremacy continue to conspire together to manipulate us and socialize us to stay exhausted in this vicious cycle of intergenerational and collective trauma. Even the planet is exhausted from being constantly toiled and tortured. Slowing down and resting provides us all with an opportunity to interrupt this cycle. And because rest is resistance comes from a Black liberation lens, it is rooted in this understanding that no one is free until we are all free, because we are interconnected. So a sacred pause, making time for more rest. This is an embodied daily commitment to not only end these harmful legacies of exhaustion, but it also lets us begin anew. Begin anew when we can tap into our deepest selves, back into the inherent worth and dignity, who some would call divinity, that is our birthright. And Hersey emphasizes that rest, it's not a privilege or a luxury, only available to a few select. Rest is a necessity for each and every single one of us, because each of our bodies is our own, no matter what oppressive systems have taught us. And in order to be liberated, we must deprogram the violent messaging we have received, that our bodies belong to someone else, and that we're only worthy when we're producing or doing. Rest is subversive because it insists this: I am enough now. Not when and if I do X, Y, Z. That you are enough and worthy now. But beloveds, this type of rest is not a shallow self-improvement project. It is a slow, very slow, ancient embodied spiritual practice. And I think my grandmother knew, like Tricia Hersey's grandmother knew, that when we ignore and deny our body's need for rest, we sometimes lose touch with our center or our spirit, which we need to imagine a more alternative world of liberation. And Hersey suspects that while the legacy of exhaustion resides in every single one of us, it especially lives in the bodies of those with melanated skin, those who are descendants of plantation labor and other marginalized peoples. Connecting that it was likely my grandparents' Mexican immigrant background and years of working in fields, that is probably why they valued rest, that was humbling for me. But keeping a weekly Sabbath-keeping practice, a day of deliberate rest, is the way that I've chosen to honor their memory and continue to heal me. Now, my personal rest portal had me traveling back in time to a place in my own family tree to reclaim some ancestral wisdom. And now, we are going to dive even deeper into the rest portal and transport us back even further in time to a place in our family faith tree. Some of you may know that Transylvanian Unitarianism is the predecessor to our liberal Unitarian Church of the modern era, the first U in our UU. The Protestant Reformation arrived in Transylvania in the early 16th century. And within Unitarianism, a Sabbatarian movement started to emerge in the late 16th century. These Unitarian Sabbatarians fused Christian and Jewish rituals. Theologically, they stressed the absolute unity of God and the humanity of Jesus as the promised Messiah. But it was actually their observance of the Sabbath, a day devoted to rest, that was the center of their faith. One of my other favorite spiritual luminaries about rest is Episcopal priest Reverend Barbara Brown Taylor. Taylor finds that Sabbath rest has two formulations in the Bible, one linked to creation and the other to the Exodus story out of Egypt. Rabbi Abraham Herschel says that the first holy thing in creation was not a people or a place, but a day. In Scripture, God made everything in creation and called it good. But God rested on the seventh day and called it holy. As devout studiers of the Holy Scriptures, the Sabbatarians took very seriously a weekly day of rest to honor the Sabbath. And so I like to think of these Unitarians as the Sabbath keepers in our Unitarian family tree. The Unitarian Sabbatarians also knew very intimately what it meant to be a people of resistance. Because after they started to grow in size, they became one of the largest religions in Transylvania. They started to suffer two major persecutions, one in the year 1618 and the other in 1638. Their charge, you might ask? Propagating the validity of the Torah among Christians. And so as part of an effort to suppress the Sabbatarian movement, which was growing, a whole bunch of laws were enacted, making their religious practices outlawed. And Unitarian churches started distancing themselves, formally declaring that the Sabbatarians in their churches were not proper members, and they were forever banned from fellowship. The Sabbatarians were imprisoned, their personal homes and houses of worship were demolished. Some converted to Christianity to avoid severe punishment, and others fled to the mountains. But for almost 4 centuries, while the Sabbatarians experienced fierce persecution, the flame of their faith was unable to be extinguished, because it is believed that most of them kept their Sabbath-keeping practices private and did so in secret for another 2.5 centuries before they eventually, across generations, converted more fully into Judaism. So, as you use, we rekindle the flame of our Sabbatarian ancestors when we center rest and healing for our collective liberation. But I must warn you of something. Rest, which Hersey calls a meticulous love practice, it isn't so easy. Because the thing is, the more I commit to incorporating moments of rest or Sabbath-keeping practice in my life, sure, I feel those emotions that I did on my grandmother's lap. Sometimes I feel calm and peaceful and restored. But I also more often feel anxious, guilty, shame, pain, and grief. Reverend Barbara Brown Taylor calls these the Sabbath sickness. And Tricia Hersey describes these uncomfortable feelings that can rise up when we slow down to rest as an unraveling and undoing of trauma. Rest is also an embodied work of refusal. And so taking rest can be very disruptive and countercultural, which makes it a risky spiritual practice. So, here's the thing. We can start small. I challenge you to ask yourself this question. When and where can you find a moment for rest just for today? When and where can you find a moment of rest just for today? Finding rest can be so many things. It can be sky gazing, closing your eyes for 60 seconds, daydreaming while looking out a window, taking a longer shower in silence, saying a prayer, knitting, crocheting, taking time away from technology, and even laughing intensely. And for me, I found it can also be deeply listening to music. Earlier, I shared that song from my Grandma V. La sana, sana, colita de lana. The rhyme that consoled the anxieties of my childhood and lured me to wind down. And I've used it as a personal lullaby of rest for me. And I only very recently learned its English translation. Do you want to hear it? Yeah. It's heal, heal, little tail of the frog. If you don't heal today, you'll heal tomorrow. Which is that gentle reminder that disrupting grind culture, it's going to be a very slow, lifelong process for healing and liberation. And I'm happy to share, I have also added another psalm to my Rest is Resistance playlist. And it happens to be a chant from my largest family, my UU family, each and every single one of you, that we sometimes sing together from time to time. Sung together in a round, for me, this song transforms itself into a shared ritual. And it's one that I now like to imagine is one way that we can commune with and honor our Sabbatarians of Transylvania in our Unitarian family tree. And maybe, just maybe, if we listen deep enough, we can hear their voices enchanting us to return again. Return to the home of our soul. Come sing with me.